In May 1941, the most terrifying war machine on the planet was not a tank. It was not a bomber. It was 50,000 tons of German steel, bristling with 8 15-inch guns, each capable of hurling a shell the weight of a small car over 15 miles with pinpoint accuracy. Its name was Bismarck. This was not just a battleship. This was a statement. A fortress that could move at 30 knots. The Nazis had poured every ounce of their engineering brilliance into this vessel. Its armour belt was over 13 inches thick, impenetrable. Its fire control systems were the most sophisticated ever built, using advanced radar that could target enemy ships beyond the horizon. Its guns could fire 3 salvos per minute, each one capable of obliterating a city block. The British Admiralty had intelligence reports. They knew what was coming, and they were terrified. Because Bismarck's mission was not to engage the Royal Navy in glorious combat. Number. Its mission was Operation Rheinübung, Rhine exercise. Break into the Atlantic, find the convoys, the merchant ships carrying food, fuel, weapons from America to Britain, and sink them, all of them. Britain was an island under siege. Those convoys were its lifeline. If Bismarck succeeded, if it reached the open Atlantic hunting grounds, it could sever that lifeline. Britain would starve. The war would be over. This was the monster, invincible, unstoppable, a symbol of Nazi technological supremacy. Now let me introduce you to the hero of our story, the Fairey Swordfish biplane. The Germans knew about the Swordfish. They were hardly a secret. British carrier squadrons had been flying them since 1936, and when German naval intelligence briefed their admirals on British naval aviation capabilities, the reaction was laughter, because the Swordfish was a joke. Picture this, an open cockpit biplane. 2 wings, one stacked above the other, held together with wire struts. A fabric skin stretched over a metal frame, you could literally poke your finger through it. A single radial engine up front, and a crew of 3 men sitting exposed to the elements, wearing leather jackets and goggles like they were barnstormers at a county fair. Its top speed? 139 miles per hour, with a tailwind, on a good day. You could outrun it in a modern family car. The British nicknamed it the string bag, naval slang for a shopping bag because it could supposedly carry anything. But there was another meaning to that name. A string bag was also something old, something worn out, something you'd use until it fell apart and then throw away. This was 1941, the era of the Supermarine Spitfire, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, sleek deadly aircraft pushing 400 miles per hour, dueling in the skies over Britain in the greatest air battle in history. And here was the Swordfish, a relic, a museum piece, a design that looked like it had wandered in from 1917, lost and confused, wondering where all the Red Barons had gone. German naval officers genuinely believed that if a Swordfish ever attacked the Bismarck, their anti-aircraft gunners would swat them from the sky like annoying flies, if they didn't die laughing first. But before we get to the Swordfish's moment of glory, we need to understand the inciting incident, the event that turned this naval operation into a blood feud. May 24th, 1941, the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. The Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, had been spotted trying to break into the Atlantic. The Royal Navy scrambled to intercept. Leading the charge was the pride of the British fleet, HMS Hood. She was magnificent. At 860 feet long, she was the largest warship in the world. Sleek, powerful, beautiful, a floating symbol of British naval supremacy. Commissioned in 1920, she had spent 2 decades as the most famous warship on Earth, touring the Empire, showing the flag, reminding the world that Britannia still ruled the waves. The British called her the Mighty Hood. She was Britain's Bismarck. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland commanded the force, Hood, and the new battleship Prince of Wales. They intercepted Bismarck at dawn on the 24th. The range closed rapidly. Both sides opened fire. What happened next would haunt the Royal Navy for generations. Bismarck's 5th salvo. A shell, one single shell weighing over 2,000 pounds, arched across 6 miles of cold grey sea. It plunged downward at a steep angle, and it struck Hood in her one critical weak spot, her thin deck armour. The shell penetrated deep into the ship, into the aft magazine, where hundreds of tons of cordite propellant charges were stored. There was a flash. A pillar of flame erupted 500 feet into the air, then a catastrophic explosion that tore the ship in half. From the bridge of the Prince of Wales they watched in horror. One moment, Hood was there, a massive battlecruiser firing her guns, manoeuvring, fighting. The next moment, she was gone. 3 minutes. From hit to sinking. 3 minutes. 1,418 men. 3 survivors. The shock rippled through the Royal Navy like a physical blow. The mighty Hood. The unsinkable Hood. The ship that every sailor in the fleet knew and loved. Gone. In 3 minutes. At the hands of a ship that had been at sea for less than a week. When the news reached London, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill was at a dinner party. An aide handed him a note. Churchill read it, went pale, and simply said, "The Hood has blown up." It wasn't just a naval loss, it was a psychological trauma, a national humiliation, the symbol of British naval power erased in moments by the Germans' newest creation. Churchill's response was immediate and absolute. He gave an order that would echo through every naval command in the Atlantic. Sink the Bismarck. I don't care how you do it. I don't care what it costs. You must sink the Bismarck. This was no longer about strategy. This was about vengeance. Every available ship in the North Atlantic was diverted. This was the largest naval manhunt in history. Battleships King George V, Rodney, Ramillies, battlecruiser Renown, aircraft carriers Victorious, Ark Royal, cruisers Norfolk, Suffolk, Sheffield, Edinburgh, Dorsetshire, dozens of destroyers, the entire home fleet, Force H from Gibraltar. Even ships from convoy escorts were stripped away, leaving merchantmen vulnerable, just for a chance to catch Bismarck. The German ship had not escaped unscathed from the Denmark Strait battle. Prince of Wales had scored 3 hits before her guns malfunctioned. 1 shell had ruptured Bismarck's fuel tanks. The ship was leaking oil, leaving a telltale slick across the ocean. And Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the operation, made a fateful decision. Abandon the mission. Head to the French port of Saint-Nazaire for repairs. But first, they had to survive. On the evening of May 24th, the carrier HMS Victorious launched its Swordfish squadron, their first combat mission. In deteriorating weather, they found the Bismarck and pressed home their attack through heavy anti-aircraft fire. 1 torpedo hit, midships, a perfect shot, and it bounced off. The torpedo struck Bismarck's massive armour belt and simply deflected. The explosion barely rattled the teacups in the officers' mess. The German crew reported they felt a slight vibration, nothing more. The Bismarck was not just big, it was virtually impervious to anything except another battleship's heavy guns at close range. The British needed to get close, but Bismarck was fast, and it was heading for the safety of U-boat patrolled waters and Luftwaffe air cover from occupied France. The clock was ticking. Then Bismarck's Admiral Lütjens showed why he'd been chosen for this mission. In the early hours of May 25th, as British cruisers shadowed using radar, Lütjens ordered a brilliant tactical manoeuvre, a complete 360-degree turn using a rain squall as cover. The pursuing cruisers lost radar contact. When they reacquired it, they assumed they were still following Bismarck. They weren't. They were following Bismarck's last course. The ship itself had circled behind them and was now steaming southeast toward France. By the time the British realised their mistake, Bismarck had vanished. For 31 hours, the most hunted ship in the world was invisible, gone, disappeared into the vastness of the North Atlantic. In London, the Admiralty was in a state of controlled panic. Fuel levels were critical. The pursuing battleships would have to turn back soon, or they'd never make it home. Bismarck, meanwhile, was getting closer and closer to safety, to Saint-Nazaire, where it could repair, refuel, and then set out again to terrorise the Atlantic convoy routes. The Hood's death would go unavenged. The Bismarck would remain invincible. Britain's humiliation would be complete. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. German Admiral Lütjens, confident he'd escaped, broke radio silence to send a long, detailed report to Naval High Command in Berlin. British listening stations triangulated the signal. They had a rough position, but rough wasn't good enough. They needed eyes on target. On the morning of May 26th, a lumbering PBY Catalina flying boat from RAF Coastal Command, piloted by Flying Officer Dennis Briggs, was conducting a sweep pattern far to the south of where the British had lost contact. Through the rain and mist, Briggs spotted something, a massive grey shape. He descended through the clouds to confirm. There it was. Bismarck. The beast had been found, but there was a problem. A critical, desperate problem. The British battleships King George V and Rodney were 130 miles away, too far. At current speeds, they would not intercept Bismarck before it reached the protective umbrella of Luftwaffe air cover. Before it reached the range of U-boats from the French coast, Bismarck would escape, unless it could be slowed down. And what did Ark Royal carry? The joke, the antique, the obsolete 139-mile-per-hour string-bag biplane. Vice Admiral James Somerville commanded Force H. He was a fighting admiral, aggressive and unorthodox. When he received the orders to stop Bismarck at all costs, he understood exactly what at all costs meant. His flagship, Ark Royal, was pitching violently in the deteriorating weather. The North Atlantic was living up to its savage reputation. Force 10 winds, 30-foot swells that would soon grow to 50, the kind of storm that made seasoned sailors pray. And Somerville was being ordered to launch an airstrike in this, his weapon, 820 and 818 naval air squadrons, Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, the aircraft that German intelligence had dismissed as irrelevant. Commander Tim Coode, leading the strike, assembled his pilots in Ark Royal's ready room. Most of them were in their early 20s. Some had never dropped a torpedo in combat. They looked at the weather reports, at the briefing maps showing Bismarck's position, its speed, its firepower. They understood what they were being asked to do. This wasn't going to be a textbook carrier strike. This was going to be barely controlled chaos. The weather was beyond appalling. The Ark Royal was heaving so violently that her flight deck was rising and falling over 60 feet with each wave. The deck crew had to time their movements, scrambling to secure aircraft between rolls, then running for safety as the next wave hit. To launch a Swordfish, you had to rev the engine to full power, release the chocks, and hope you reached flying speed before the deck tilted and you slid into the ocean, or before the deck pitched up and you stalled and crashed. To land one, assuming you survived, you had to approach a moving platform that was bucking like a rodeo bronco, catch one of the arrestor wires with your tailhook, and pray the wire held as the deck dropped away beneath you. Men had died doing this in calm weather. Today's weather wasn't calm. It was apocalyptic. The first strike launched in the early afternoon. 15 Swordfish, armed with new magnetic detonator torpedoes, theoretically superior to the older contact detonator models. They found a ship through the rain squalls, a large warship. They attacked. There was only one problem. It was HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser that had been sent ahead to shadow Bismarck. In the chaos, the confusion, the deteriorating weather, someone had forgotten to inform the air crews that Sheffield would be in the area. The Swordfish pilots dove to attack what they thought was Bismarck. The Sheffield, recognizing the attackers as friendly, desperately signalled with every lamp and flag it had. The Swordfish pilots, committed to their attack runs, dropped their torpedoes. By sheer luck, and the incompetence of the new magnetic torpedoes, which detonated prematurely in the rough seas, every torpedo missed. It was a disaster, a humiliation. The pilots returned to Ark Royal in shame, having nearly sunk one of their own ships. But there was an upside. The magnetic torpedoes were clearly useless. For the next strike, they'd revert to the old reliable contact torpedoes, the ones that actually worked. There was time for one more mission. Maybe. The sun was setting. In another hour it would be too dark. Bismarck would escape into the night, and by morning it would be under Luftwaffe protection. This was it. The last roll of the dice. 15 Swordfish were prepared, led by Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode, this time armed with contact torpedoes, this time with Sheffield vectoring them toward the correct target. The pilots climbed into their open cockpits. No heated cabins, no pressurization, just leather jackets, goggles, and a scarf wrapped around their faces against the freezing spray. Their observers, the navigators, squeezed into the middle seat, clutching their maps and navigation instruments, trying to plot courses on soaking wet paper. The tail gunners, the telegraphist air gunners, or TAGs, settled into the rear cockpit with a single .303 machine gun. Against Bismarck's hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, that machine gun was laughably inadequate. It was there for morale, not effect. The launch was terrifying. The flight deck crew later said it was the worst conditions they'd ever worked in. Launching each aircraft was a test of timing, courage, and luck. One mistimed release, and the aircraft would tumble into the sea. But one by one, 15 Swordfish clawed their way into the storm. Flying a Swordfish in perfect weather was challenging. Flying one in a North Atlantic gale was borderline suicidal. The aircraft bucked and yawed in the turbulence. Rain lashed the pilots' faces. The fabric skin of the wings drummed and rippled in the wind. The compasses spun wildly. Navigation was mostly guesswork. They flew at wave-top height, 50 feet above the water, to stay under German radar. In these conditions, that meant the pilots could see the tops of the waves rushing past, close enough to touch. One moment of inattention, one wrong control input, and they'd cartwheel into the ocean. After 20 minutes, Sheffield appeared through the murk, signalling frantically. "The enemy is 12 miles ahead, on your port bow." The Swordfish adjusted course, and then they saw it. Bismarck. Massive. Menacing, steaming at full speed towards safety. Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode divided his formation. Attack from both sides, confused the defences, split their fire. The German lookouts spotted the incoming aircraft. Alarms sounded across the ship. Every anti-aircraft gun on Bismarck swiveled toward the threat, and then the sky erupted. Bismarck carried dozens of anti-aircraft guns, 20mm cannons, 37mm flak guns, even its massive 15-inch main battery guns loaded with time-fused shells designed to create huge shrapnel clouds. Thousands of shells. A wall of fire and steel. The British pilots had never seen anything like it. Tracers arced through the darkening sky. Shells burst in black puffs all around them. The noise was overwhelming, even over the roar of their engines and the howling wind. But something strange happened. The German gunners, trained on modern aircraft, couldn't hit the Swordfish. The fire control systems were calibrated for fast-moving targets, aircraft doing 250, 300 miles per hour. The Swordfish were barely doing 90 miles per hour into the headwind. The shells were exploding ahead of the biplanes, not on them. The gunners kept having to adjust their aim down, 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 as the painfully slow Swordfish droned forward. One pilot later said it was like the Germans were trying to swat flies with a sledgehammer. The obsolescence that made the Swordfish a joke had become, against all logic, an advantage. The Swordfish split into subflights. They descended through the flak down to 50 feet, so low they were flying through the spray kicked up by the massive waves. The observers called out ranges. "Ready, steady, now!" The pilots pressed their release buttons. The torpedoes dropped away, hitting the water with enormous splashes, then straightening out and running true toward the massive target. 15 torpedoes in the water. On Bismarck's bridge, Admiral Lutyens and Captain Ernst Lindemann watched the attackers with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. These British pilots had courage. They were pressing home their attacks despite the overwhelming defensive fire, but surely these primitive biplanes couldn't possibly. One torpedo hit amidships. It exploded against the armour belt. Barely a scratch. Another hit forward. Same result. The Germans began to relax. See? Just as intelligence had predicted. The Swordfish were obsolete, their torpedoes ineffective against modern armour. But then, just then, one torpedo, launched by Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat, ran slightly long. Instead of hitting the heavily armoured belt amidships, it struck Bismarck near the stern. The explosion wasn't particularly impressive. Just another detonation in a battle already filled with noise and violence. But this hit was different. The torpedo struck just in front of Bismarck's rudders. The blast buckled the armour plating, it jammed the port rudder hard to port, stuck at a 12-degree angle, and it damaged the starboard rudder mechanism. Within seconds, the damage reports flooded Bismarck's bridge. The rudders were jammed, the ship was turning, and it wouldn't stop turning. The engineering crews raced to the stern. They tried everything. Manual override systems, emergency hydraulics, cutting gear to free the jammed mechanism, teams of sailors trying to shift the rudder by hand through sheer brute force. Nothing worked. Bismarck, the most advanced battleship in the world, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, the unsinkable fortress ship, was sailing in circles. Worse, it wasn't just circling randomly. The jammed rudder was forcing the ship to turn northwest, back toward the British home fleet, back toward the battleships that had been hunting it for 3 days, back toward King George V and Rodney. Admiral Lutyens sent a final message to Naval High Command in Berlin. "Ship unmanoeuvrable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." He knew. They all knew. The joke had just signed their death warrant. The German admirals who had laughed at British naval aviation were no longer laughing. On the morning of May 27, 1941, the battleships King George V and Rodney closed in on the crippled Bismarck. The German crew, exhausted, low on ammunition, many of them seasick from spending the night circling in the storm prepared for the end. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. For 90 minutes, the British battleships pounded Bismarck from close range. The German ship's guns fought back at first, but the British gunfire was devastating. Shell after shell smashed into the superstructure, knocked out gun turrets, started fires, killed crew by the hundreds. By the end, Bismarck was a floating wreck, burning, listing, her guns silenced, but she was still afloat. That armour belt, that magnificent German engineering kept her from sinking even under the most savage bombardment. The British cruiser Dorsetshire moved in and delivered the final blow, 3 torpedo hits at point-blank range. At 10:40 a.m, Bismarck capsized and sank. Of the 2,200 men aboard, fewer than 120 survived. It was doomed, decisively, irrevocably doomed, by 15 men in obsolete fabric-covered biplanes, aircraft that flew at less than 140 miles per hour, aircraft that looked like they'd escaped from a museum, aircraft that every German naval officer had dismissed as irrelevant. The stringbag pilots of the Fleet Air Arm had accomplished what modern bombers, heavy cruisers and even battleships could not. They had stopped the unstoppable. They had avenged the Hood. Lieutenant John Moffat, the pilot who dropped the torpedo that jammed Bismarck's rudder, never claimed credit. He always insisted it was a team effort, that any of his fellow pilots could have made that hit. He was probably right, but history remembers his name. The Fairey Swordfish would go on to serve throughout the war. It would sink more Axis shipping than any other Allied aircraft. It would drop the torpedoes that crippled the Italian fleet at Taranto. It would hunt U-boats in the Atlantic. It would serve with distinction until 1945, outlasting many of the modern aircraft that were supposed to replace it. Because sometimes the old ways work. Sometimes the obsolete weapon is exactly what you need. Sometimes the joke gets the last laugh. The Germans learned this lesson the hard way, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, as their invincible super battleship limped in circles, doomed by a biplane that everyone had laughed at. Never underestimate the string bag.